Freud might suggest, as you do, Jeff, that mainstream academia has kind of put up this defense mechanism against parapsychology and against the paranormal. And we could ask ourselves right now, if we want to do just a quick psychoanalysis of that, what is this kind of paranoia, or why do they throw up this defense mechanism? What are they hiding? What is repressed?
Keep watching to learn more. You can now download all 9 copies of the New Thinking Aloud magazine for free, or order beautiful printed copies. Go to newthinkingaloud.org. New Thinking Aloud is presented by the California Institute for Human Science, a fully accredited university offering distant learning graduate degrees that focus on mind, body, and spirit. The topics that we cover here. We are particularly excited to announce new degrees emphasizing parapsychology and the paranormal. Visit their website at cihs.edu.
Book 4 in the New Thinking Aloud dialogue series is Charles T. Tart, 70 Years of Exploring Consciousness and Parapsychology, now available on Amazon.
Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. Today we're going to look at psychoanalysis and parapsychology, and specifically we're going to see if we can psychoanalyze the discipline of parapsychology. My guest is Dr. Jacob Glazier, who is an adjunct professor in the Department of Positive Human Development and Social Change at Life University, USA. He is also an online adjunct professor in the Department of Applied Psychology at New York University, Steinhardt campus. He is the author of Arts of Subjectivity, a new animism for the post-media era. Welcome, Jake. It's a pleasure once again to be with you.
Hi, Jeff. It's great to be here.
We're going to be exploring psychoanalysis and parapsychology. And in particular, your approach is very unique to try and psychoanalyze an entire scientific discipline. To begin with, I thought it might be interesting to bring up a lecture that was given, I think, back in the 1960s by my own dissertation advisor, the philosopher Michael Scriven, who basically said parapsychology is data in search of a theory, and psychoanalysis is a theory in search of data. That there's a way in which these two disciplines complement each other.
Psychoanalysis historically has been attacked from, for example, philosophers of science for not being able to meet certain criteria that they established that would give it some kind of scientific status. And then, for example, being falsifiable, producing falsifiable explanations that can then be tested in the laboratory and so on and so forth. And so I think your beginning anecdote, I think, is really powerful in the sense that psychoanalysis has, again, been accused of kind of reproducing itself in some ways, theoretically, since in part it relies on evidence taken from the clinic as opposed to evidence taken from the laboratory, from experiments, things like that. And I think that parapsychology, to interface psychoanalysis with parapsychology, was what I really attempted to do in my article that we're discussing today. I think there's a really fruitful dialogue that can be produced when you kind of juxtapose these two. Interestingly, both are fringe disciplines in a certain sense, certainly from the perspective of mainstream or legendary science. But, nonetheless, I think that psychoanalysis, it's kind of theoretical concepts. The concepts that I employ in my paper are from Lacanian psychoanalysis. They're really powerful conceptual tools that allow us to think about the paranormal or about psi, about how these processes like ESP can occur. And we don't need to appeal to certain physicalist models or certain metaphors that come out of science, like quantum theory. While that can be appropriate in certain contexts, I think psychoanalysis offers us a much richer kind of richer theory, I suppose, to really think about what is the paranormal.
I think one fact of psychoanalysis that has always stuck with me, especially I noticed this in my youth, in the 60s and 70s growing up, that psychoanalysis had an enormous impact culturally. It affected novels and films, and even in the field of psychology, academic psychology turned away from psychoanalysis, but I recall a study of clinicians, psychological clinicians, saying, what was your biggest influence? And far and away, it was Freud.
Freud has had an undeniable influence on 20th century thinking in all fields, not just psychoanalysis, clearly, but psychology, literary studies, even philosophy. His kind of extant pressure on these other disciplines, I think, really speaks to something about psychoanalysis that speaks to us as human beings. And I think Freud really tapped into that. While there's certain kind of, kid gloves when it comes to dealing with psychoanalysis from a scientific perspective, I think there's also, and I touch on this in my paper a bit, there's a certain kind of subversiveness or kind of more technically would be called like a counter-hegemonic power to psychoanalysis. And what I mean by that is that it challenges these normal ways of understanding the world. And it can be, in fact, as I articulate in my paper, it can be really threatening in some ways. Not unlike how psi or these fringe paranormal discipline phenomena can be threatening to normal ways of being in the world. And so I think, again, in that way, both psychoanalysis, it's, for example, it's reliance on kind of libidinal, sexual, id-driven desires or drives is certainly can be threatening in some ways to people, having to deal with repressed memories or certain forms of repression that haven't been sublimated or brought to the fore. And also, parapsychology is threatening because phenomena like ESP or psychokinesis or even reincarnation, the survival question that I bring up a little bit in my paper. These are phenomena that challenge such sacred institutions in our society, like religion, or what would it mean for us if we did survive after death? And that has a whole kind of host of ethical consequences that I think, as a society, at least, we haven't really thought through that. And parapsychology, I think, attempts to try and start that conversation.
I suppose, now that I think about it, the enormous resistance to parapsychology within academia could easily be thought of as an avoidance defense mechanism from a psychoanalytic point of view.
I think that's, you took words right out of my mouth in a certain way, because I think that it is so threatening to the scientific, materialist kind of, Richard Dawkins kind of understanding of human evolution or even the development of human psyche that, Freud might suggest, as you do, Jeff, that mainstream academia has kind of put up this defense mechanism against parapsychology and against the paranormal. And we could ask ourselves right now, if we want to do just a quick psychoanalysis of that, what is this kind of paranoia, or why do they throw up this defense mechanism? What are they hiding? What is repressed? Right. And that's what, as a psychoanalyst, that's what I'm interested in. The kind of repressed, latent, forces of the unconscious that kind of hold together a certain discipline. So, for example, we could say, like the experimentalism in parapsychology. What binds those scholars and researchers together as a kind of unit or as a kind of group? And, that, in one of Freud's articles on group psychoanalysis, he suggests that there requires some kind of unconscious libidinal investment between each of the members in order for them to function as a group. And, we could ponder, or we could, go down that tangent and kind of explore what is it about that causes them to kind of reject maybe more qualitative approaches to the paranormal, or more kind of ethnographic or pluralistic approaches.
Well, we'll be getting into those issues, I'm sure. But before we go there, you mentioned that your unique approach is what's called Lacanian psychoanalysis, and we should define that and show how it is a little different than the strict Freudian approach.
Sure. So Lacan is arguably, the second most famous psychoanalyst when compared to Freud. So he was a French scholar and a French theorist that kind of brought Freud's German ideas into France. And Lacan interfaced those ideas with structural linguistics. And by doing so, he claims that he kind of rescued Freud's psychoanalysis from maybe being misinterpreted through the lens of biology, or through, kind of a different perspective that wasn't as incisive as Lacan's own. And this is why Lacan focuses so much emphasis on language, the power of language. And he goes so far as to say, the famous Lacanian formula that the unconscious is structured like a language. And so, Freud had different models. He had the early, unconscious, preconscious, conscious model, and then the later more structural model with the id, the superego, and the ego. Whereas Lacan pivots to a model that looks at what in structural linguistics is called the signifier. And the signifier is the kind of emptied unit of meaning or word that can be linked into certain chains in order to produce a sentence or a context. And so for Lacan, this kind of idea that the unconscious is structured like a language, he places emphasis on the analogy, analogy in the sentence, the like. So it's like a language. It's not strictly a language, but it's like a language. And so in my paper, I introduce his technical term, which is la langue, and that's just the language in French. But this allows Lacan to kind of articulate this kind of pool of signifiers, or this kind of messy pool of words and meanings, a loose-knit association of various symbols that structure the unconscious. And so we're able to produce utterances or meaning because we're able to produce contextual and meaningful sentences using those kind of symbols that are just floating around. And so that's why, for example, the famous psychoanalytic technique of free association is so powerful. Because when you just kind of articulate freely on the couch of the analyst, you're getting closer to the truth of the unconscious, because you don't have these kind of defense mechanisms that are guarding these associations that are chaotically rolling around in this kind of unconscious pool.
I think everybody's familiar with the idea of psychoanalyzing an individual and using the method of free association and the whole idea of the psychoanalytic couch. You lie down, you're in a mild altered state of consciousness, and let's just see what bubbles up in your mind through a chain of associations to kind of go deeper within. But how would you apply that to a scientific discipline like parapsychology?
It's a little bit of an extrapolation, for sure. And I think that psychoanalysis has famously proliferated itself in arenas like cultural theory or cultural studies, media studies, again, literary studies. And so I suppose my attempt to try and produce a kind of psychoanalysis of parapsychology isn't too far afield from the way that psychoanalysis has been employed to look at cultural artifacts, perhaps, or the way that certain groups form within society. But I wanted to really try, because of my interest and because of what my scholarship and my research program, I really wanted to try and look at parapsychology. And I thought that, there is such an interesting juxtaposition to be made between the subversive power of psychoanalysis and what I call the threatening, or to put it into different terms, the kind of trickster quality of Psi. And that is where I make that kind of connection, because I think that, as I kind of say in the paper, that parapsychology can be read as a science of lack. And what I don't mean that pejoratively, I don't mean that negatively, but the way that Psi operates, if we use Trickster theory, the George Hansen's famous book, Trickster and the Paranormal, kind of inaugurated, I believe, this movement in parapsychology, to look at the way that Psi can sometimes be reproducible in the laboratory. But if you try and use the exact same conditions, set up the almost exact same kind of experiment, you can't get the same result. So there's this elusiveness, we could say, about Psi, that it almost behaves like it's trying to evade capture or kind of thwart the kind of normal experimentalist way of looking at the paranormal.
Yeah, it would seem, although it's one is never quite sure. There's always reason for hope, but it would seem as if the Psi, the term that parapsychologists use as a generic umbrella term for everything they study, wants us to know that it exists, that it's real. But if we ever try to harness it, it's like no way.
Yes, and I think that there's that. Interesting, if we try and another researcher in parapsychology, Kennedy, suggests that, if we try and turn Psi into a technology, and what he means by that is try and harness it in some ways, it again employs this kind of elusive agency that it tries to get away or tries to kind of thwart the way that we're trying to corner it. And so I think the figure of the trickster that George Hansen kind of puts into play and that is articulated through, different cultures around the world, has this kind of inversion about it that, it changes forms, depending on the cultural context. Psi appears differently. Right? We could suggest that in our materialist, kind of capitalist society, the occurrences of psi have been reduced to a low degree, just because of the way our society is put together. Whereas if we look at more of an indigenous culture, for example, maybe different a Native American tradition or different tribal cultures, psi is going to perhaps show up more frequently, or we could say differently. So again, to go back to psychoanalytic terms, I would say that, our social fabric represses the kind of ability for psi to kind of show itself. And, this kind of tricky nature that psi has, again, we can see, if we look through an anthropological lens, we can see it change forms in various ways.
Well, the trickster archetype is fascinating. Where I live in the southwest in Albuquerque here, there's the figure of Coco Paley. You see it everywhere. And it's a trickster figure, plays the flute. I think he's considered a friendly figure, but everybody has the sense, that Coco Paley is going to be playing tricks on us.
Yeah, and that's the kind of elusive, cunning, wily nature that is kind of a part of the quality of psi, is that, there's this sense that sometimes tricksters trick us in order to teach us a lesson, and sometimes they trick us just to cause harm or to kind of, cause damage. And so you kind of never know what you're going to get. And so there's, as I think there's a manner in which psi, in this way, kind of, plays back with the kind of researchers or the kind of practitioners that are trying to investigate it. And I would even, go so far to say that there's a certain kind of agency about psi. And I think that is a lot for some people to take, because it invokes a view of the world that is very foreign to our normal way of understanding the way things work. But, I really believe that we can't be the kind of Western imperialists and kind of impose our will on the world and kind of extract as many resources or information out of it as we can, because we're going to get duped. It's going to come back. There's going to be this circle back of some kind of consequence that is going to be a part of this kind of selfish extraction of data and resources. And so there is an interesting subversive nature, I think, between, again, psychoanalysis and the subversive power of the trickster in parapsychology, and more pointedly, the way that psi can challenge traditional mainstream scientific models, and the way that it's threatening to those models, and how we see defense mechanisms arise because of the threat that psi poses to normative scientific ways of understanding the world.
For example, in the field of psychology, it's been my experience that amongst the most hostile professions to parapsychology is mainstream psychology, particularly academic mainstream psychology. And they do feel threatened because, as I think they put it, if psychic phenomena are real, extrasensory perception or any of its varieties and psychokinesis, it would tend to invalidate, 100 years of research that they've been doing that never took it into account.
You're right. And I don't think that it necessarily invalidates all that research, because I think that, this notion of science developing a theory of everything, or Lacan would call it a meta-language. And so for Lacan, I hate to use terms that we haven't defined, but for Lacan, there is no other of the other. And what that means is that he just means there's no meta-language. So we could envision this as there's different avenues or different fields of investigation, and mainstream psychology has taken us down a certain avenue of investigating psychology from a very specific perspective. But there's also different avenues to pursue, and those different avenues may or do include things like psychokinesis or ESP. And so I'm not sure if it's quite right to say it invalidates the old model, but it certainly opens up a wider view of what human psychology is. And I think that wider view is pushed back against by certain psychologists because, again, I hate to say it, but it's threatening not only to their livelihood, to their institutions, but it's on a very personal level. And this is where psychoanalysis is helpful. It's threatening to religious ideas, it's threatening to social ideas, the way that we think societies should function. I think Jason Georgiani even speaks about this in one of his talks with you, Jeff, is that if we admit that ESP is real, what does that say about our political system and how we should organize our political system? And so there's, a whole lot to be thought out and a whole lot to be said about the implications that admitting these phenomena into existence, the implications they have for not only science, but also for society as such.
Yeah, Georgiani points out, for example, which I think is crucial for the field of psychoanalysis, that the implications of parapsychology are that we have to redefine what we mean by privacy.
Exactly. And interestingly, psychoanalysis, is astute at investigating the way that we guard our privacy and the way that we, again, put up different defense mechanisms, the way that, our transference operates out in the world. So who reminds us of mom and dad? And what does that mean for our relationship to authority figures, the way that we're Oedipalized, and so on and so forth. And so, I hadn't thought about it until right now, but there's certainly a bridge to be built between the politics of parapsychology and the absence of privacy in a lot of ways. And I wonder what psychoanalysis could tell us about that kind of new politics if we were to kind of, think that out a little bit more.
I'm sure there would be a lot to be said. Well, it strikes me that in your paper, one of the most profound insights that you made is that parapsychology started out as an empirical science using the metaphysics of empirical science, which is very straightforward, that for something to be considered real, it has to be perceived through the external senses in the physical world. And the findings of parapsychology point us in a very different direction, that things that are totally internal, totally first-person observations become equally real, maybe even more real. And that seems to be a paradox right at the heart of parapsychology.
One's inner psychic life for psychoanalysis is the most primary, primary source to be looked at. And I think, again, the kind of psychodynamics that are going on within an individual certainly have a connection to the way that not only we think about the outside world, but even energetically, the way that we are able to kind of relate to another person or able to relate to the outside world. And, parapsychology tells us that when our psychodynamic inner life is thrown off, we can have effects like, psychokinesis effects or poltergeist effects, where, you have objects, for example, being stacked in a corner, or, banging of the cupboards. There's William Roll, I think, has done some work on how the way that the poltergeist phenomena is connected to our kind of inner psychic life. And so I think more generally, I think the pivot to looking at the kind of rich, more introspective model of examining subjectivity is the right move, because I think, at least historically, we've been more out in the world. We've been trying to gather data. We've been trying to categorize. We've been trying to, name different animals, and all these, we've been out in the world. And so I think a return to subjectivity, or a return to taking seriously the kind of data or the kind of phenomena that we can divine from our own kind of introspection, I think is, a good move for parapsychology.
I'm reminded of a psychoanalyst who is also a parapsychologist, Dr. Jule Eisenbud, who wrote a book, Parapsychology and the Unconscious. And he came up with a fascinating insight, especially for someone like me, because I've been looking at training psychic abilities and applying psychic abilities. And Eisenbud's insight was, don't do that. He was saying that the problem is if people have unconscious, self-destructive impulses or complexes, that their psychic abilities will end up functioning in the service of those self-destructive complexes. And he gave examples from his own clinical practice of how people with psychic abilities got themselves into a lot of trouble. I think if I look at humanity as a whole, Jake, it strikes me there's a lot of self-destruction, obviously implicit in human behavior right now. We're living through all kinds of ecological crises at the moment of our own creation. So it does make me think that perhaps parapsychology is being saved by the trickster from making things even worse.
I would even maybe go a step further and say that some of these psychic blockages, or we could say traumas that we haven't been able to deal with, not only collectively, but on an individual basis, they block psi, right? Or like your story of training participants to actually do psi tasks can actually backfire because they haven't resolved these various traumas. And so I think that it's a blessing, I suppose, in one way that we don't have the kind of prevalence of psi that could perhaps be possible. But at the same time, I think this is where the conversation between parapsychology and psychoanalysis can be really helpful, because I think that if we continue it, we can look at healing these kind of more psychological, clinical, or psychotherapeutic issues that everybody has, right? And we can look at healing those, and we can see how that process of healing unlocks or doesn't unlock certain psychic abilities. To put it simply, once you get all of the garbage out of the way, you can see the light of day. And so, I wonder, once we do that work on an individual and a collective level, we might be able to kind of coax psi out to play.
I would agree with you. It seems to me that if you look at the folklore coming out of spiritual traditions that when people have spiritual breakthroughs, they're very often accompanied by synchronicities and other forms of paranormal manifestations. And the spiritual traditions often say, don't pay too much attention to it, but just acknowledge it's a sign you're on the right path.
There's a tendency, I think, for the mind to cling to meaning and to cling to these, what we see as special occurrences. And I think, even from a more mindfulness or meditation perspective, I think just acknowledging the sign and being able to let it go and even being thankful for the synchronicity and then moving on, I think is really a sign of health and psychic fortitude. But yeah, no, I think that, once we, again, I think, and the reason I bring this up is because I do a lot of theory work on not just the individual psychological level, but more social and cultural level. And I think that we have to look socially and culturally at ways we can kind of restructure or heal our society from kind of the very narrow and I would even say unethical materialist scientific lens that has been foisted on us over the last couple centuries.
Now, to go back to the notion of the trickster, I often puzzle over it because you can find many examples where it seems the trickster is at play. Examples where it seems there's a very promising experimental protocol in parapsychology. It gives very good initial results, but by the time you have a dozen scholars attempting to replicate it, the results, while still significant, become weak, and the possibility of applying it seems to vanish. But there are some exceptions to that. People I've interviewed, Russell Targ, and another one is Stephen Schwartz. These are people, I've done many interviews with them, and throughout their careers, they've been successful in producing psi in the experimental sense and also in applying it. And it seems to me we could learn a lot from studying more carefully the really successful experimenters in the field, because there's something about them that seems to move them beyond the trickster stage.
Yeah, and I think we have to ask ourselves why these legitimate, reputable, and replicatable experiments aren't being taken more seriously by mainstream psychology. And not only that, why aren't we hearing about them through different academic organs like journals or newsletters, things like that? And so I think that's where this kind of institutional guardedness comes into play. That, yes, these studies and experiments have lived up to certain scientific standards, but nonetheless, we're still going to ostracize them, or we're still going to ignore them. And so what does that say about, mainstream psychology? Not only that, what does that say about belief as such, insofar as that simply by the sheer fact that they do not fit into our normal way of understanding the world, we're going to not admit them. We're going to render them as anomalous. And that's what I think, again, why I think parapsychology is in such an interesting place as a discipline. Because it's fringe, which some people think that that's negative or bad. It's not necessarily a bad thing to be fringe. And it's kind of, you have more maneuverability in some ways. And because it's more fringe, it's also, I argue in my paper, has a certain kind of subversive quality to it. And that I think Thomas Kuhn would say that it's a kind of anomaly in the normal paradigm. So the normal scientific paradigm that we've been operating under, parapsychology has a chance to be that anomaly and to cause perhaps a new scientific revolution. And what that would do would kind of overthrow this kind of drab, materialist, experimentalist understanding of not only the world and psychology, but it would bring in a whole new way of not only conceptually thinking about the world through metaphors like ESP, PK, so on and so forth, but actually engaging the world in a very different way. And, I've suggested here and in other interviews, different ways that we as researchers or parapsychologists, we can methodologically kind of shake things up. And we can look at these phenomena from more of a phenomenological lens, or more of an autoethnographic lens, more of an anthropological lens. And so we don't have to kind of fit into what it means to be, mainstream science. And in fact, again, parapsychology is in that unique position that it gets to kind of challenge that kind of ordinary framework that we've been relying on for so many centuries.
Well, you write in your book, The Arts of Subjectivity, about a new animism. And I'm under the impression that from the point of view of the guardians of materialistic academic thinking, their fear is that a new animism would become what I think they call the rising tide of superstition. That there needs to be a methodology that can distinguish between a ontologically viable animism and the whole realm of superstition.
That fear is certainly there, and we challenging Enlightenment values that have been handed down to us is again this kind of threat that certain individuals and institutions see. And that's why, I think the Trickster, again, to bring the Trickster in here, the Trickster has no love of instrumental rationality. In fact, it's much more of an animal, sensual creature that doesn't really care about upholding reason as, what sets the human apart from other animals. Is I think an Aristotelian question that we have reason, or that we can be rational. Well, the Trickster doesn't see it that way. In fact, the Trickster knocks down human exceptionalism. And what I mean by that is that the privileging of the human as a kind of special site or object that is unique and kind of special. What the Trickster does is it not only does away with that, but again, to return to the kind of animistic view of the world, it sets the human as no different than any other being, in the sense of, no privileged place. Of course, there's differences among beings, but it doesn't afford the human a special place. And so, I think people see a return to animism as maybe a step backwards, right? Because we're going back to more of a kind of tribal, not nature, earth, these different tropes that are more tied down to the sensual qualities of the body or of the earth, the planet. Whereas, the other side, wants to kind of push along technological progression, instrumental rationality, kind of globalization, this kind of manifest destiny of Western civilization. And so there's a threat in the superstition that animism kind of injects into where we're at with our current society. But I think that I don't think it's an either or. And so I don't think it's you can only have animism, you can't have kind of Enlightenment Western civilization. I think there's a way to marry the two. And so I think part of me thinking about these concepts and ideas, part of my work in this article was to bring the kind of, animistic, we could suggest, or even some, scientists or philosophers would accuse psychoanalysis of being superstitious in a lot of ways. And so there's that spirit or ethos that psychoanalysis has with animism in certain ways, and bringing psychoanalysis into dialogue with the more traditional scientific parapsychology. And so I think that there's a lot more to be said on the topic. I've started, a kind of follow up to this first article. And, I'm hoping to kind of not only build on a couple of the ideas we've talked about in terms of the trickster, in terms of the unconscious and the way that, even privacy functions in a certain politics of parapsychology. So I'm hoping to continue the conversation because I think, Jeff, there's a lot more to be said on the topic.
I think what I hear you saying, Jake, is that the methods that have developed under the umbrella of psychoanalysis, and I think I would add Jungian analysis, Jungian depth psychology as well to the list, offer us a tool for entering into an animistic worldview without falling into superstition.
That's a good way to put it, because the theory and the concepts that psychoanalysis offers us kind of can structure that passing. It gives us the kind of anchor or kind of a mooring by which we can still have a kind of theoretical animistic sense while not having to leave, the benefits of like modern medicine behind.
Well, Jacob Glazier, once again, this has been a fruitful, enlightening, elevating, and informative discussion. Thank you so much for being with me.
Thank you, Jeff. It was great to be here.
It's a pleasure to be with you once again. I look forward to future discussions as well. And for those of you watching, thank you for being with us. New Thinking Aloud is presented by the California Institute for Human Science, a fully accredited university offering distant learning graduate degrees that focus on mind, body, and spirit. The topics that we cover here. We are particularly excited to announce new degrees emphasizing parapsychology and the paranormal. Visit their website at CIHS.edu. You can now download all 9 copies of the New Thinking Aloud magazine for free or order beautiful printed copies. Go to newthinkingaloud.org.
Book 4 in the New Thinking Aloud dialogue series is Charles T. Tart, 70 Years of Exploring Consciousness and Parapsychology, now available on Amazon.
For early access to our videos and live stream events, sign up for our free weekly newsletter at newthinkingaloud.org.